have bottled water here too. You sure?
Just remember where the car is.
Oh yeah, I remember. I lost it.
Or fried Oreos?
We don't have any fried Oreos.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, you're recognizing it already. Oh, yeah.
Okay, you're welcome.
Hello, how are you? Good, thank you. Mickey, Mickey.
You see it now. I got the glasses off last time. Which I still wear them. And I bet you're.
Yes.
bigger.
Oh, real, these triplets too.
It's double, I guess, but it's really large.
Yeah. They're fabulous things. I have a big double one in my kind of family room slash laundry room. You use it for everything, you know, you bring your vegetables from the garden, you wash out the watering buckets for the goats. Oh my God.
This video is a bit different. Oh my gosh. I really don't know that it's that much different, honestly. I mean, there have been times where I have started a video piggybacking off of something that I have said in a prior video, if not the immediately preceding video. It's just that this video, this feels a bit different. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Oh, it feels so good. I'm so grateful for the beautiful climate that has graced the Northeast, especially Troy, New York, the Northeast area of late. Especially because of the intense humidity and heat that was experienced at times during the summer, and because I don't have air conditioning, I tend to feel that acutely, and it can feel extremely draining. And so I'm so grateful to have the beauty of cool, sort of temperate breeze. And so as I sit here at the beginning of this next video, I haven't started recording anything except for the trip I just took to Brimfield. And other than that, I have a little bit of notation here around items that have come up in the last several videos that kind of have called out to be circled back to. And it feels like it's being circled back to in a similar way that a conclusion sort of summarizes what has been discussed throughout a text. And so what I've notated are items from previous videos, specifically the last 4 videos. Some of them are more generalized, some of them are rather specific, some of them gravitate around local events here in Troy, and some of them gravitate around very broad concepts in either the culture or just sort of rather esoteric metaphysical substance points. I've said this in the past couple of videos that what I tend to touch on, specifically here in Troy, is very localized. It's very localized to this particular area, and I understand how that may not appear on the surface as very relevant in a broader picture. The interesting thing about the happenings, the experiences here in Troy, the events, the developments here in Troy, help ground a lot of these more abstract perceptions. And what I notice about the events here in Troy and why I've gravitated so much around them throughout the stream of videos is there's something bigger happening under the surface with a lot of what's been referenced within the videos and what's appearing to happen on the surface through these developments. And for example, a lot of what I've touched on and what I've focused on is the experience here in Troy around bonding, the municipality bonding for replacement of lead pipes on private property, and there being a New York constitutional issue around public funds being used for private purposes. And there are new developments that I have not yet touched on in any of the videos because it just happened this past week. I do intend on reflecting on these newer events. For now, I just want to say that what's so interesting to me about this particular aspect here in Troy is that the relationship between the municipality, the representative aspect of this body, of this collective body, and the relationship of this body to itself, and the relationship of the body to perhaps a more broad collective body of the state, and even the federal body, is absolutely fascinating to me and really reflects and mirrors the ways in which the individualized body relates to the aspects within itself. And so perceiving and embodying those aspects within oneself, and then being able to sort of experience that on an externalized sort of collective scale, and reflecting on that, observing it, inquiring about it, being curious about it in wonder and gratitude and patience and trust, and experiencing those values within oneself and seeing how that's reflected in these relationships is so real to me, and it's magnetizing to me. It's profound, and the shifts that happen through the energetic shifts that happen through that introspection and self-reflection and self-awareness, and the embodiment that comes from the perceptions from within, that are illuminated from within, experiences within oneself, within those relationships, really helps magnify where in the relationships that are sort of externalized there is unworkability, because it's sort of this experience of wisdom and self-awareness that shakes a foundation that isn't quite aligned with supporting a more integrated, holistic being that is integrating all these infinite experiences and aspects and values. So I just love how witnessing the unfoldment of the process of bonding and the constitutionality and the networking with the state and the networking with the collective on the ground, if you will, how that all plays together and reflects this more metaphysical understanding of oneself, and how the perceptions of oneself and the narrative that is expressed within oneself structures the landscape that is perceived and experienced as our sort of collective body, our collective organization, our collective organism. And so this is just one example. This is just one sort of grounded, real world sort of example of that interplay and that informative processing that continuously invites imagination and inquiry and breaking through sort of structural rigidities that feel very confining and perhaps overbearing on a sense of liberation and a sense of integrity within oneself. Based on what notes I have written for myself, I do have a bit of a plan. So I'm going to start here with the continuing with the bonding here in Troy, and the newer developments that have come about, specifically a city council meeting that occurred this past Thursday, which would have been, what's today? Today is September 7th. So the meeting would have been September 5th, if I remember correctly. And a record article that came out this morning. So we're going to start there, and yeah. Okay, so here is the record article from today regarding the city council meeting from this past Thursday, which was September 5th. At this meeting, some state representatives attended to attempt clarification with the intention of clarifying some of the state perception and how the state relates to the desire of the city to bond for replacement of private pipes. So let me take a step back for a moment. So as it has been interpreted, at least up until this point, by myself, and I believe there are others who have interpreted it this way as well, that the city would be quote unquote sort of reimbursed for money that it upfronts to replace these lead pipes on both public and private property. And the reimbursement would come through the state or federal government. I don't recall exactly which one it was thought to be, if not both. But suffice it to say that there was an impression that this funding from the sort of state or federal government would reimburse the city for paying up front whatever the cost is to replace the lead pipes. So what seems to have come through from Assemblyman John McDonald in this meeting was that this funding from the state or federal government would not technically, if you will, be quote unquote reimbursement, because the city would more so be acting in this, and I'm using these words here, be acting in a more administrative capacity, in the sense that it would kind of be acting as a middleman between the state/federal funding and the contractors who would be implementing the replacement, so that the contractors would send the bill to the city, and the city would then funnel that bill to the state/federal government for payment. And so that payment would then get funneled back to the contractor through the city. And therefore, it wouldn't technically be reimbursement, and it wouldn't technically be municipal funding, because according to this perception, it has nothing really to do with the municipality's budgetary funding. It has nothing to do with municipal funds. It's more the state/federal payment of contractual services. So that was kind of the idea thrown out there by John, and it was kind of interesting to hear that perception. And so that gives a little bit of an idea as to what comes next, which is this question that I had. So when I was listening to the city council meeting and this conversation was going on, what came through for me is that there is this question about who is bearing the financial risk in terms of the liability for payment. And the contractor who provides the service, I suppose I'm interested in the contract, in the agreement with the contractor, and what is specifically articulated in terms of liability for payment. Is the liability for payment solely on the city of Troy? Is there anything going to be put into the contract regarding the sort of the whether we call it reimbursement or call it just state/federal, because I'm not quite sure, although it does have here, it's the Environmental Facilities Corporation, I believe, who is providing the quote-unquote, for lack of a better phrase at this point, the reimbursement monies, the grant monies to cover these contracted services. The Environmental Facilities Corporation is something that I touched on in the last video, because I had not heard of them before. I wasn't aware of this entity. And if I remember correctly, it's an entity of the state. It's an agency. I know it has this corporation status, which I found kind of bizarre, but it has this structuring, I suppose, of a state corporation that provides grants and finances the water infrastructure within the state. And so I'm curious as to what the terms are going to be, if any, within the contracts with contractors, and to what degree there is any liability for payment on the EFC, or is it solely on the municipality? Because if it's solely on the municipality in the contract, then even if there is this state program to supply grant monies or quote-unquote reimbursement for contracted services, if they're not party to the agreement, and the agreement specifically places financial liability on the municipality, then I don't quite understand how it could be said that it is not municipal funding. According to John McDonald, okay, because, quote, because it's state and federal funding, you can feel very comfortable that the state legislature has said it is clear. You can use that. Where it gets tricky is when it's municipal funding, and right now that's not the issue before the council. But it seems like it is, depending on how the contract is articulated, how it is termed, especially in the context of financial liability to the contractors. And one of the other aspects that came up during this meeting was the experience that some contractors, I suppose, or just the personal experiences some have already had, perhaps with this particular program, perhaps just with the EFC, but in terms of receiving quote-unquote reimbursement, it can be a very slow process according to some people who are still waiting on being paid for services they provided months ago. And when it comes to replacing lead pipes, if I remember correctly, the mayor said that the cost per month could be upwards of $300,000. And so for a contractor who provides these services, it's unlikely to me, it seems very unlikely that they are going to have the capacity to go long periods of time not receiving payment. And so, to my understanding, they just stop services completely until they're paid. Now, it's also been said that if all the procedures are followed and all the documents are submitted, then the payment from the EFC, theoretically, the turnaround would be relatively quick. It really is very dependent on what the terms of the contract will say in regard to the EFC and the liability of the EFC. Yeah, see, this is the other thing. Okay, so the largest clarification was about the $12.5 million grant. For months, the city and its residents have been under the impression they must front the money, and then the federal government will reimburse them. Hence, the city must bond for private property. But it is unclear if that... Okay, so the interesting thing about that impression, the city's impression thus far, and the reimbursement impression, was that the city was not acting as a middleman. That the body of the city would, and the resources of the city would pay the contracted services, would pay for the contracted services. And then it was the federal / state grant monies / reimbursement monies that would come back to replace what the city expended, so that it would be money, resources from within the municipal body going to pay for services, not money from the sort of state / federal body going to these contracted services with the city, just sort of playing middleman, sort of flow through gatekeeper, if you will, more of in an administrative capacity. So in one instance, you sort of have more of a resource of the municipality and municipal monies, funding expended for a service that it is then being reimbursed for from the state or city, or excuse me, the state or federal government replacing it. What John MacDonald is saying is that it's not quite that. It's not municipal funding per se from the municipal body. It's not the body of the municipality that is expending. It is the body of the state/federal body that is expending, and the municipality is just acting in an administrative sort of gatekeeper capacity. So it's not technically reimbursement in that sense. And so how resources are flowing, how resources are being related to, how bodies are being related to and represented is very interesting here. And so under the city's impression of being reimbursed and using municipal funds, the city was further under the impression that it would have to bond for private property because that was the most, at least to my understanding, that was the most expeditious manner of raising the funds to pay for these services. And which is interesting because that to me just says that this raising of bond money is to the city, it would be considered municipal funds, which is a note I'm making as a bit of a side note for myself. But it is unclear, goes further, it has been unclear if that bonding for private property is legal under the state's constitutions about gifts to private citizens. And this is the constitutional provision in the New York Constitution, the gift and loan clause, which I wasn't certain way back when was the accurate constitutional provision clause regarding this particular issue, but I came to find out is the accurate clause. It was also so interesting to me during the meeting. So Senator Jake Ashby says, quote, "There are some constitutional questions for municipal funds, but for state and federal funds, it's pretty clear it doesn't apply." Why wouldn't it apply? I don't recall if the constitutional provision just applies to municipalities, or if it's worded a bit more broadly in applying to state government funds. What differentiates state and federal funds applying to private property from municipal funds being used for the same purposes? They being the city, need to authorize bonding as a backup system should that funding, the funding from the state/federal government, not come quickly enough. Additionally, the State Department of Health requires that they authorize bonding for the full $12.5 million to move forward with the grant. What seems likely to me at this point is that what the EFC will put in writing is what they already have in writing, which probably is that as long as all the paperwork they require is submitted with all the requested documentation in a timely fashion, that they will provide payment in a timely fashion. That's most likely what they are willing to put in writing. it seems very unlikely to me, and I will be surprised if they are willing to put in writing anything more than that regarding payment, especially and specifically taking responsibility and financial liability contractually as a party to the contract with the city and the contractors who are replacing the lead pipes. I do not see that as very likely. And because of that, the city is sort of put between a bit of a rock and a hard place. The city is sort of bearing the risk of being sued, being legally liable on two fronts. They're potentially bearing the risk of legal liability to the contractors should the EFC's payment not come through in a timely fashion. So that if for some reason payment is not paid in a timely fashion, the municipality remains on the hook to pay those contractors. And if there are not those funds to pay those contractors because there is a reliance on the EFC, so that's another thing, is this reliance, the reliance on it. I don't know. I think I need to look back a little bit at contractual provisions and language that could be added. There is something I remember about reliance. You know, if the city goes into the agreement with contractors in reliance upon an understanding with a third party who's going to pay for those expenses, there's something about that. But it just seems like the municipality is kind of on the hook and liable to the contractors for the potential of non-payment through the EFC. And they're also on the hook should they actualize the bonding issuance. They are on the hook for being sued by these organizations that, to my understanding, these organizations that specifically focus on these municipal actions to bring suit on. And it seems like no matter what, it almost seems like no matter what, the sort of quote-unquote end result is going to be a court determination around the constitutionality of this bonding issue. I don't know. The whole I know, maybe it will be very seamless. Maybe it will be very seamless. Maybe it will be sort of smooth in its flow, and there will be no contentiousness. There will be no contention from contractors. There will be no financial harm, and perhaps there will not be a quote-unquote need for any bonding. So one of the moments of sort of inspired thought that came through in a prior video was around the bonding issue, and specifically with the New York constitutional clause, the gift and loan clause. And it specifically came through when I was taking notes on the video "An Unruly Following." And the note was I felt inspired to explore a little bit of the history of the gift and loan clause. And so I made a note for myself for sort of the future, if you will, to circle back to that. And so now feels relatively like that point of circling back. So, do 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 do. Great song, by the way. Okay. The gift and loan clause in the New York State Constitution is found in Article 8, Section 1, and prohibits the use of public resources for private gain. How that doesn't apply to the state, I don't know. Excuse me. Okay, the clause applies to counties, cities, towns, villages, and school districts. Why not the state? Okay, we can't see the whole text here without creating an account, and I don't feel called to do that. Adopted between 1846 and 1874, these clauses, which I assume is meant to say this clause as amended, were a response to widespread corruption and mismanagement of public monies on the part of the state legislature and municipalities. Notwithstanding the unequivocal nature of New York's gift and loan clauses, during the 20th century, these provisions have been amended numerous times, adding exception upon exception to the broad prohibitions. They have been circumvented or diluted in the name of meeting the growing demands being placed upon the modern state and its political subdivisions. The tension between the restraints provided by these provisions and the public programs called for by advocates for a greater role for government in solving social problems has been resolved in favor of the latter. Public benefit corporations, also known as authorities, are addressed in Article 10 of the Constitution. In their first incarnations, state constitutions, like their national counterpart, had few provisions concerning finance. Interesting. The first two constitutions of New York, adopted in 1777 and 1821, did not contain any restrictions on public aid to private enterprise. On the contrary, grants and loans of state money and credit to private corporations were fairly common occurrences, justified by the general view that the state had an obligation to promote the prosperity of all its members. The 1938 reports of the New York State Constitutional Convention Committee, commonly known as the Poletti Report, has divided pre-1846 gifts and loans to private enterprises into two periods: moderate subsidizing between 1790 and 1816, and very extensive and highly speculative subsidizing between 1816 and 1846. It's interesting. If I remember correctly, this time period between 1816 and 1846, give or take, but this time period was very correlated with the, I believe, rise in the, what was it called? Albany. It was, I believe, led by, oh my gosh, let's see if I can recall this. This is going back months. Oh gosh, what was his name? Van Buren. Van Buren, before he was president, had established a like political machine. It was sort of the first political machine. It was called like the Albany. The word is not coming to me. Let's see. Regency? The Albany Regency. The Albany Regency was a group of politicians who controlled the New York state government between 1822 and 1838. Yeah. The group was among the first American political machines. Negotiations between various members of the Regency for financial transactions and appointments to government office, exposing how members of the Regency were able to profit from speculatory notes and political corruption. So, between 1790 and 1816, or excuse me, between 1816 and 1846, a very extensive and highly speculative subsidizing period. This transformation resulted from an increase in the need for infrastructure projects, such as roads, turnpikes, canals, and railroads, and the realization that these enterprises were too great for private capital to support. The state either had to undertake these large projects and their commensurate costs, or provide assistance to private entities who would assume the projects. By the time of the 1846 Constitutional Convention, state aid had been authorized by statute to 33 corporations, including banks, companies providing transportation and infrastructure, healthcare facilities, and educational institutions. In response to public criticism of private projects, Governor William Seward stated, "It is not only the right, but the bounden duty of the legislature to adopt measures for overcoming physical obstructions to trade and commerce in this state, and for furnishing to each region, as far as reasonably practicable, facilities of access to the great commercial emporium of the Union, fortunately located within our own borders." That the legislature may direct the construction of such works at the expense of the state, or authorize their construction by associations, and may aid them by loans of the credit of the state upon conditions of perfect indemnity. Okay, so I've switched to a different format of the same article, where I can view the article in its entirety. The plausible pretense of developing the resources of the state and conferring benefits on the people. So it kind of has this notion of inner cultivation. So the cultivation of inner resources, those resources that are sort of perhaps innate, inherent within the body. Developing those resources, cultivating those resources, growing those resources, if you will. Being attentive to those resources. acknowledging those resources, being grateful for those resources. The immediate impact of the changes implemented by the 1846 Constitution was to limit the ability of the state to support further internal improvements. But the gift and loan clause provided an ineffective barrier to assistance to private enterprises. It's kind of interesting to qualify it as internal improvements. There's something almost inherently critical, and I mean critical, judgmental, but I don't necessarily mean judgmental in any way other than to say there's a sort of assumption, perhaps, that something needs to be improved. To say that, I've often used the phrase, there's room for improvement, but there's a bit of a distinction between observing where there is room for improvement and observing and perceiving a need to improve something. Perception of a need to improve almost assumes, or does assume to some degree, that what is being improved upon is not perfect and okay the way that it is. And saying that something is perfect or perceiving the perfection inherent in something doesn't have to negate that there is also room for improvement. It doesn't also have to mean that there isn't room for improvement. They don't have to be mutually exclusive in the sense that perception of perfection can't also mean that there is room for improvement, because they can be experienced simultaneously, where there is this perception of perfection and there is a perception that everything is perfect the way it is in its current state of unfoldment, if you will, and that which is being perceived as perfect also has room for improvement, that what is being perceived as perfect and in a state of natural perfection is in sort of a natural organic unfoldment and process of emergence being improved upon already, if you will. That the perception of needing to improve is perhaps a bit of, has a quality of criticality to it that's not wrong and that's not bad. It's just that perception alone at the head of a table as the guide, if you will, as an authority, doesn't feel workable. It doesn't feel integrated into a more holistic picture and a more holistic process. And it feels a bit more aligned, if you will, to go back to that more internal cultivation of resources, the observation of resources, the gratitude for those resources, the perfection of those resources, and the perception and embodiment that there can be simultaneously held the perception of the perfection and the perception of that unfolding process of improvement in a sort of organic sense, and to tap into that and to observe and witness and participate from an internal, grounded, sort of centered sense of integrity, participate in that unfoldment of improvement feels of a very different quality. I don't quite understand this. Even though the 1846 Constitution directed the legislature to restrict municipal debts and loans of credit to prevent abuses, this provision was interpreted as authorizing the state to allow localities to lend their credit. With loans of state credit off limits, communities along proposed railroad routes and at terminals aided in financing railroad projects either by direct grants or by exchanges of municipal bonds for railroad stock. In sum, New York's first attempts to prohibit certain uses of state money failed to produce the desired results. In the words of the 1967 Temporary State Commission on the Constitutional Convention, the state resorted to direct grants and loans of money to private corporations. The localities lent railroads their credit and made direct grants of money and property to private corporations. End quote. All of the work that had been done by the 1846 Convention to address and control the besetting sin of incurring debt had not reduced the amount of bonded debt in the state. It simply resulted in a change in creditors from the state to its municipalities. By 1872, local governments of the state had undertaken indebtedness of over $214 million, an amount in excess of 10% of the assessed valuation of real and personal property within the state. Although the 1867 convention failed to close these loopholes, reform would not be long in coming. The 1938 convention signaled a greater recognition of the role of government in providing for the social and economic welfare of the citizens of New York. In areas such as housing and social welfare, the convention constitutionalized and expanded policies previously enacted by the legislature. The convention adopted provisions which gave both state and local governments sufficient authority to meet the housing needs of New Yorkers, and also made it a mandatory obligation of the state to provide, quote, aid, care, and support, end quote, to the state's needy. I don't know. I'm kind of almost like, I'm glad about what I said before, but at the same time, there's part of me that at this moment is like so in that dreamy Neptunian state that I'm not focusing at all on what this is saying. I mean, it's very interesting. It really is very interesting. It's just that I'm not focused. Not feeling focused. I know it's dark, but I felt like keeping it that way. I'm sitting here being reminded of an inquiry into where I was at a year and a half ago. And in exploring this, I couldn't really remember, and I don't tend to write down experiences that I've had to memorialize them. So in thinking about this, I sort of realized that the YouTube videos have, to some extent, become a little bit of a memorialization of where I'm at in terms of how I
relate to the sort of quote-unquote externalized reality through the perceptions that I intend to embody. And what's interesting is I'm noticing myself in the current energy and in the prior day or two feeling a shift, a very deep shift in how I am embodying a reality that isn't evident in the externalized world. And as I was feeling into this and contemplating it a bit, I remembered how several videos ago I explored a bit of evidence in a philosophical, sort of ontological, metaphysical way, and what innately is evident within information, or how information is innately evident, and how it largely expresses from within oneself. And it's an interesting embodiment that I'm feeling because it feels like a dream becoming realized. And yet there's nothing externally to quote unquote prove that to be the case. There's nothing externally that I can point to say that a dream is being realized. At least nothing that would traditionally support that sort of conclusion. And so, and yet I feel it. I feel it so strongly, and it's something that I haven't really felt before. And so I notice it, and I'm observing it and acknowledging it and leaning into it with gratitude. And so I sort of wanted to memorialize the acknowledgement of that to include within this video, because I do intend to articulate a bit more what does appear to be happening internally here. And it's interesting how that ties back in with a video from several weeks ago, and just is very exciting to me and interesting, and I'm just really in awe and wonder and find it very mysterious yet comforting and familiar. And so I just wanted to attempt to articulate some of, at least scratching the surface of what's being felt currently. And so, yes.
So I just want to quickly interject that since the recording of this video, there has been a bit of a shift in how I narrate and how I acknowledge the felt experience of evidence from within myself. And I don't, by expressing it as quote unquote nothing in the externalized reality is evident, if you will, I don't mean that there isn't aspects of the physical reality to point toward that can be utilized as a traditional sort of measurement of what is perceived as success. In the perception that I have, or I suppose I should say, there are perceptions of success in the sort of traditional measurement of it. However, what I really intend to say is that evidence as a sensation within myself is transcendent is transcendental of the sort of traditional measurement of what it is to feel successful. And that evident sensation of a realized dream from within myself is speaking so loudly that any traditional measurement of what it is to feel successful, and as though a realized dream is showcasing, is eclipsed. And so that was sort of the intentionality I had going into that video to express, and I just wanted to clarify the aspect of nothingness that I referenced. There's going to be a bit of a pivot. At a point yesterday, I realized that the direction I was heading, going down the rabbit hole of exploring the history of the gift and loan clause, it wasn't where I mentally was at, and it kind of felt a little bit like I was forcing it. And as the day was progressing, I realized that what was really calling to me the most was the last note I made to myself from the last video, which was in consideration of legality and how legalities are formulated, specifically taking into account the sort of literary structuring that's utilized often in developing legal code. And so as I was contemplating this morning and really looking over my notes again, I felt as though there was this interesting stream coming through that kind of tied together a lot of the other notes that I had written down at the end of the last video that I did want to circle back to for further exploration. And I'm noticing that perhaps a different way of going about this that feels a bit more exciting to me in this moment is to really explore the other aspects of this literary structuring that came through as I was exploring center embeddedness and performative utterances, specifically edge embedded and phrasal nodes, constituency, relation of phase structure. And a lot of this sounds very technical, and it is very technical to me in the sense that I am not consciously familiar with these terms and what they mean in a literary context. But there's something about them that really speaks to me in an analogous way to sort of the structuring and the patterning within the body that is the collective, and the body that is sort of the individual, the body that even is perhaps the cell, and beyond that. And so as I was really leaning into this thread, it really started to show as itself as almost this umbrella encompassing the possibility of a lens, looking through this lens and inquiring into what possibility there is in regard to structuring legalities and how legalities are even perceived and embodied and experienced, especially in the context of what it is to behave criminally, to punish. And these are concepts that I touched on in a prior video that I also wanted to go back and listen to include and weave together within this sort of lens. And so having that lens to then view these more grounded experiences here in Troy with regard to the bonding and the planning board creation, which happened several weeks ago, that I touched upon and focused on for several videos. And so it's very interesting to play around with these ideas and to play around with these analogies, weaving together the sort of underlying commonalities to really see through a lens that almost in a way is a little bit biomimicry, in a way that sort of mimics how organic life sort of unfolds fundamentally. And I say that not in I know everything, that this is everything to know, that I'm not saying fundamental in a sense that it's everything there is and it's everything there is to know and this is all the information there is. That is not what I intend to express by saying fundamentally. The intention in expressing fundamentally is to articulate the feeling of being grounded in the underlying, the experience of what feels I'm not quite sure how does this one articulate? There's a quality of fundamentalism. There's a quality of quantum mechanics, quantum construction, quantum theorizing that just has a feeling of that sort of, I'm feeling it's very challenging to articulate what I intend by fundamental, but what I don't intend to express is that what is being expressed is all that there is. I don't know if I'm going to use any of that, but anyway. So we're pivoting, I'm pivoting, this is a point of pivoting to weave together and to follow the threads and potentially weave together a bit of a tapestry that encompasses and develops the framework of a different lens of perceiving and experiencing and embodying the inner the inner the sort of inner legal code. Perhaps there will be a different articulation of that as this progresses, because saying it as legal code, it sounds so official. It sounds so formulaic and logical and reasoned. I don't know that it will be, in an absolutist sense, so logical and reasoned in its application, in its unfoldment. Articulating this, I feel like I know I've said this before, where I can feel the sense of it. I can feel the sense of what I am pulled toward and what I sort of am aiming toward. It's just articulating it can be so, I'm not going to use the word laborious here. It's so, So hopefully throughout the unfoldment of this video, it will become a bit more articulable. But for now, I am intending to just energetically will it. So thank you. I am very grateful. Thank you for bearing with me. So on that note, let's take a little look-see at edge embedding. Okay. Sentence and word embeddings are the bread and butter of language models. An assignment of words to numbers is called a word embedding. We can think of a word embedding as an assignment of scores to the words. In language, words can be combined to get more complicated concepts. In mathematics, numbers can be added or subtracted to get other numbers. Could we build a word embedding that captures relations between words as relations between numbers? Okay, so what is a word embedding? Before we get into what is a word embedding, let me test your intuition. In the figure underneath, I have located 12 words in the plane. Now, the question is, where would you locate the word apple in this plane? There are many places it could go, but I'm allowing 3 possibilities labeled A, B, and C. What I would do is locate it in point C, because it would make sense to have the word apple close to the words banana, strawberry, and cherry, and far from the other words such as house, car, or tennis. This is precisely a word embedding. And what are the numbers we are assigning to each word? Simply the horizontal and vertical coordinates of the location of the word. In this way, the word apple is assigned to the numbers 5, 5, and the word bicycle to the coordinates 5, 1. For the sake of redundancy, let's enumerate some properties that a nice word embedding should have. Words that are similar should correspond to points that are close by. Words that are different should correspond to points that are far away. The word embedding above satisfies properties 1 and 2. Is that it? Not yet. There's something more to these word embeddings, and it is that they don't only capture word similarity, but they also capture other properties of the language. In language, words can be combined to get more complicated concepts. In mathematics, numbers can be added or subtracted to get other numbers. Could we build a word embedding that captures relations between words as relations between numbers? Let's look at 4 words: puppy, dog, calf, and cow. These words are clearly correlated. Now, to test your intuition again, I'm going to locate the words puppy, dog, and calf in the plane, and I'll ask you to add the word cow. Where would you add it in the spot labeled A, B, or C? While it would make sense to locate it in A, closer to calf, since they are both bovine, or in B, since it's an adult animal like dog, the place where I would put this is in spot C with coordinates 3, 4, Why? Because the rectangle formed by the 4 words captures some very important relationships between them. For instance, 2 analogies are captured here. The analogy, a puppy is to a dog like a calf is to a cow, can be translated into the path from the word puppy to the word dog is the same as the path from the word calf to the word cow. The analogy, a dog is to a cow like a puppy is to a calf, is also captured in this rectangle. However, this is not even the tip of the iceberg. The main property of word embeddings that is in effect here is that the 2 axes, vertical and horizontal, represent different things. If you look carefully, moving towards the right turns the puppy into a dog and the calf into a cow, which is an increase in age. Likewise, moving upwards turns a puppy into a calf and a dog into a cow, which is an increase in the size of the animal. It seems that this embedding is understanding that the words in it have 2 main properties, or features, age and size. A good word embedding would be able to capture not only age and size, but also many more features of the words. Since each feature is 1 new axis, or coordinate, then a good embedding must have many more than 2 coordinates assigned to every word. Some of these coordinates may represent important properties of the word, such as age, gender, size. Some may represent combinations of properties. But some others may represent obscure properties that a human may not be able to understand. I'm not quite certain if this context of embedding, where human language is translated into computer language, is what was referred to in the context of legal structuring. How would one be able to represent, for instance, a sentence? How about the sums of scores of all the words? I mean, it is interesting nonetheless. For example, say we have a word embedding that assigns the following scores to these words. No, I am good. Then the sentence, no, comma, I am good, corresponds to the vector 0223. However, the sentence, I am no good, will also correspond to the vector 0223, 0223. This is not a good thing, since the computer understand typo, maybe? These 2 sentences, sort of ironic, in the exact same way, yet they are quite different, almost opposite sentences. Therefore, we need better embeddings that take into account the order of the words, the semantics of the language, and the actual meaning of the sentence. This is where sentence embeddings come into play. A sentence embedding is just like a word embedding, except it associates every sentence with a vector full of numbers in a coherent way. By coherent, I mean that it satisfies similar properties as a word embedding. For instance, similar sentences are assigned to similar vectors, different sentences are assigned to different vectors, and most importantly, each of the coordinates of the vector identifies some, whether clear or obscure, property of the sentence. As a small example, here is a heat map of an embedding containing 10 entries for each sentence for several sentences So they have here highlighted. Show me a list of ground transportation at Boston Airport. Show me Boston ground transportation and what ground transportation is available in Boston. Embeddings with 10 dimensions. Notice that these sentences are all very similar. In particular, the 3 highlighted sentences pretty much have the same meaning. If you look at their corresponding vectors, these are also really similar. That is exactly what an embedding should do. I guess the 3 darkest spots, they are the 3 darkest spots in this 0. I'm not exactly sure what they mean by, if you look at their corresponding vectors, these are also really similar. The heat map is interesting though, but I'm not quite sure what it means. Yeah, that didn't really speak to edge embedding. Okay, so center embedding. In linguistics, center embedding is the process of embedding a phrase in the middle of another phrase of the same type. This often leads to difficulty with parsing. The most frequently used example involves embedding a relative clause inside another one, as in, a man that a woman loves, a man that a woman that a child knows loves, a man that a woman that a child that a bird saw knows loves. A man that a woman that a child that a bird that I heard saw knows loves. Interesting. In theories of natural language parsing, the difficulty with multiple center embedding is thought to arise from limitations of the human short-term memory. An interesting theoretical point is that sentences with multiple center embedding are grammatical, but unacceptable. Although single center embedding is acceptable. It's funny. The linguist Anne de Roek and colleagues provided a counterexample. Isn't it true that example sentences that people that you know produce are more likely to be accepted? Yeah, it's so interesting. In the English language, we can create an infinite number of sentences, even though we have a set number of words and grammatical rules. Really, a set number? We can create infinite sentences because of the rules of recursion and iteration. The rule of recursion is how we come to center embedding, by embedding one sentence within another sentence. Linguists say that center embedding could go on forever and technically be grammatically correct. The reader would, however, become confused, trying to keep track of who did what and when, because our working memory would not be able to store and keep track of all the information. Okay, so back to edge embedding. Ineffective embedding. One can tell if a sentence is center embedded or edge embedded, depending on where the brackets are located in the sentence. Joe believes, Mary thinks, John is handsome. The cat that the dog that the man hit, chased, meowed. So the cat meowed, that the dog chased, that the man hit. Yeah. It just sounds like it doesn't make sense when you say it as a full sentence. The cat that the dog that the man hit chased meowed. I suppose it would make more sense to say the cat meowed that the dog had chased that the man had hit. Or the man hit the dog that chased that, I don't know, that had chased the cat, or that was chasing the cat that was meowing. I don't know. Oh, interesting. Okay. In sentence 1, all of the brackets are located on the right. So this sentence is right embedded. In sentence 2, the brackets are located inside the sentence space throughout. So I suppose that's center embedded. Interesting, okay. There doesn't seem to be a lot coming up specifically about edge embedding. Yeah. Take a look at these two sentences. Sentence 2 is more understandable than sentence 1. The reason is that the innermost clause is embedded at the edge and not the center of another clause. Sentence 1 reads awkwardly because there are 3 strings of noun, phrases, and verbs right next to each other. Right. You rarely find that in normal language. Embedding in itself isn't a problem. It is the excessive use of it that creates chaos. Yeah, because it's sort of, in the first sentence, it kind of congregates all the verbs together at the end, so that the verbs appear very confused and very muddled. So the action, the motion, the action within the sentence is very unclear. So it's sort of segregating the nouns from the verbs that they are associated with. So it sort of separates the correlations between the actor and the action. So there's that moment of sort of separation, there's that bifurcation that to the mental sort of faculty, it has a very hard time reconfiguring it, restructuring it in a way that recorrelates the actor to the action. Whereas in the second sentence, the action is still correlated with the actor, so there isn't that separation. It's like the action is untethered from the actor. So it does appear and feel more chaotic. Interesting. Okay, I'm not sure that I'm feeling super into, I guess we can see what comes up. Center, oh, constituency relation of a phase structure. In linguistics, the constituency relation in phrase structure, maybe I meant phrase structure, not phase, refers to the hierarchical grouping of words within a sentence where certain groups of words act as a single unit, a constituent, and are combined to form larger phrases, essentially defining the syntactic structure of a sentence based on how words group together to form meaningful units. This is the core concept underlying phrase structure grammar analysis. We call a string of words that forms a group a constituent. A constituent, by definition, has a syntactic category. This is because a constituent has a syntactic distribution. Happy mailman has the distribution of a noun. That is, the entire string of words acts like a noun, not an adjective, not a verb, etc. Thus, there is a sense, an intuition at this point, that happy mailman is nouny. Whoa! What constituency means practically? Oh my gosh. What a silly boy. When I claim that a string of words is a constituent, I'm claiming that all of those I'm claiming that all of those words are grouped together under one label. Note that a single word is, by definition, a constituent. A sentence is also, by definition, a constituent. What I'm ultimately trying to do when I figure out constituency is I'm trying to figure out how information is packaged. How does any language put its pieces together to make a meaningful utterance? Precisely, in any given language, I want to know which words go with which words. This allows me to write the simplest possible rules. For instance, I can capture the idea that the mailman... Lucas? Oh my gosh. So silly. For instance, I can capture the idea that the mailman slept and the happy mailman slept both involve a subject and verb. Identifying the mailman and the happy mailman as the same thing simplifies my understanding and representation of the English language. I can reduce sentences to grammatical roles like subject-verb or subject-verb-object by identifying that the term subject may involve something that consists of more than one word, like the happy mailman. The fundamental trait that these frameworks all share is that they view sentence structure in terms of the constituency relation. The binary division of the clause results in a one-to-one or more correspondence. For each element in a sentence, there are one or more nodes in the tree structure that one assumes for that sentence. A two-word sentence, such as Luke laughed, necessarily implies three or more nodes in the syntactic structure. One for the noun Luke, subject, one for the verb laughed, predicate, and one for the entirety Luke laughed sentence. The constituency grammars listed above all view sentence structure in terms of this one-to-one or more correspondence. So sentence, noun, verb. Not quite sure what D stands for. Yeah, I mean, constituency relation appears more nested than dependency, where dependency kind of just feels very striated is the word coming through. Siloed, independent. Not to say that either is wrong, or even right for that matter. This reminds me of the exploration into the city council meeting and the meaning of meeting under the city charter, and whether same meeting is sort of the referencing the umbrella term or just the umbrella concept of the meeting of the city council on a particular day, inclusive of the finance meeting, the special meeting, the regular meeting, etc., etc. That being the same meeting in a sort of umbrella term with those individualized meetings nested within this sort of umbrella term, and all juxtaposed with same meeting only really referring to the individualized meeting of the finance meeting, of the special meeting, being independent from one another. And there was a little bit of exploration into how the two perceptions, that neither is necessarily right and wrong in that binary system per se in an absolutist sense, but that all these perceptions can exist simultaneously and be held simultaneously in a sort of, not necessarily a merging that hierarchically puts one above another, but perhaps more of an integration where one speaks more loudly at a particular moment than another, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that which speaks louder is negating the other, if you will. There's a simultaneity in it, and in that simultaneity there's a bit of a neutrality where there isn't really a labeling and a judgment as to what is right and wrong and good and bad. It's more just a sensing into what is, perhaps going back to the numerical preference, what is innately preferred as sensed within oneself, and listening to that expression express in a way that perhaps isn't solely logical, and perhaps pointing towards something that hasn't yet been actualized and realized in a physical manifestation of it. So it's really just sensing into an energy and sensing into a structure, if you will, that feels aligned with the intentionality of a moment, if you will, a sort of unfoldment, an emergence, and yet a bigger picture, greater than the sum of the parts. So the last aspect of the within the linguistic context that I really wanted to look at was the finite verb as a structural center. So let's do it. Do it. Finite verbs are the structural center of a sentence because they are the main verb and can stand alone. The significance of finite verbs in English grammar. They hold a central position in the structure of the sentence and enable communication by providing information about tense, person, and number. Finite verbs can act as the sentence root, meaning they can be the only verb in a sentence, expressing the primary action of the subject. In phrase structure grammars, so the constituency grammar, that more nested structure, the finite verb is the head of the finite verb phrase and the head of the entire sentence. Finite verbs are essential for constructing grammatically correct sentences and conveying coherent meaning in the English language. They form the main skeleton of a sentence, providing further details about the subject and the action. Finite verbs help to create a connection between the subject and the predicate of a sentence, establishing the relationship between actors and actions. Simple present tense. In these sentences, the finite verb indicates an action happening in the present. Example, she reads the newspaper every morning. In this example, the finite verb reads shows the present action and agrees with the subject, she. The finite verb within these sentences illustrates an action that happened in the past. Present perfect. In these sentences, finite verbs work with auxiliary verbs like have or has to indicate an action completed at an unspecified time in the past. Those examples show how finite verbs vary their forms to adapt to sentence structure and convey accurate grammatical information. Interesting. Excuse me. Okay, English grammar contains several classifications of finite verbs based on their structure and usage. Regular verbs follow consistent patterns of inflections, adding ed to form the past tense and past participle. Irregular verbs do not follow a specific inflection pattern, resulting in varying past tense and past participle forms. Modal verbs can, could, may, might, shall, should, will, would, must are used as auxiliary verbs to convey abilities, possibilities, permissions, or obligations. It's interesting to think about the root sort of finite verbs being to attend, to finish, as the center points that ground the constituency being the sentence as a whole. Not necessarily the auxiliary verb being must finish and may attend, but that auxiliary verb sort of adding dimension. I don't know if I would say that it grounds the center point. Perhaps it can be said that way. And maybe in this example, the intention is not to look at may and attend as mutually exclusive, but to look at them as a constituency. That constituency being a finite verb in and of itself as a sort of unit. So interestingly, in that way, it's as though the may is nested within the attendance aspect of the sentence, of the motion, if you will, the movement. It's sort of being used to express an inherency, an inherent quality within the movement, the flow. I'm sort of, as I'm saying this, I'm continuing to fall back to how legal code is written, but more so how commandments have been written and rules are formulated. And it seems like with modal verbs, which is often how legal code is written, may, shall, must, there is sort of this conveyance of an expression that is inextricably unified with how flow, how movement unfolds. And I'm not saying that that's wrong. I'm not saying that that's bad. It's just very interesting to acknowledge it in this way, in this rather technical way, and to conceptualize and philosophize beyond how it currently is, at least perceptually, experientially, apparently, and to really expand through into territory that perhaps isn't reliant on this mode of expressing action, and allows the action to stand on its own more, perhaps. I don't know any examples offhand, but perhaps in time they will come through more clearly. And perhaps obviously, if I may use that terminology. I mean, because one of the things that's also interesting is I was having a conversation yesterday, and in the conversation, there was mention made of a program that this person has access to. And it's a program that is run by the state. And if this person does not, and the program is voluntary in the sense that they may voluntarily admit themselves into this program. However, what came through this conversation as well is that it's more likely than not that the state can argue that if this person were not to voluntarily admit themselves into this program, that non-action, if you will, could essentially be used against them to say they have this opportunity to apply themselves and admit themselves into a program that the state is offering, and them not doing so is evidence that they are not committed to helping themselves. And in a way, it sort of reminded me of either the pleading of the fifth or the remaining silent when being interrogated, that there is this almost default conclusion that where there is silence and where there is a pleading of the fifth, that the person is hiding something. And I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm not saying anything about it other than it's interesting how these modal verbs of may, that you may remain silent, that you may plead the fifth, that you may admit yourself into this program, can still be used as an auxiliary verb to convey exactly what it's saying here, used as an auxiliary verb to convey abilities, possibilities, permissions, or obligations. And it seems like how these modal verbs are it's almost as though the modal verbs are given, I don't know, it's like the meaning of the word in and of itself, the meaning of the constituency, the meaning of the ability, the possibility, the permission, the obligation. It's like in that conveyance, what is the meaning of that it's not even the meaning of that conveyance. It's in the meaning of how that conveyance is responded to. Or it's not even that. It's that, and it's almost like it becomes the opposite of what it means. That may means must. That must means may. I don't really know where I'm going with this, but there's just something about it that is really like screaming something out, and I'm really not quite sure what that is. It's sort of the subtext, but it's subtext that has developed and unfolded through sort of a cultural, I in a way want to say innate preference. An innate preference on the part of the actor, depending on whether the actor is the state, whether the actor is the person who is remaining silent, pleading the fifth, not admitting themselves into a program, the actor who is the sort of third party and not directly involved. So it's interesting how these sentences, this textual framing and this textual structuring of communication does seem to provide somewhat of a skeleton in how there is relationship between one another and relationship within culture and social engagement. And yet it just showcases how much meat is on those bones. Meat in terms of subtext and intuition and innate preference, innate numerical sensing. That sort of inner, I keep saying inner legal code, and I don't necessarily have anything to point toward to say this is what I mean. But it goes back to the last video when I was really starting to explore the confluence, is the word coming through, the confluence of legal structuring and how legalities express, legalities perhaps not so much as performative utterance. Performative utterance being the making it so, the declaration, if you will, making something so. So legalities perhaps not so much as a performative utterance, a declaration making something so, and within that declaration of making something so, there is an inclusiveness of this modal verbiage that conveys an ability, a possibility, a permission, an obligation. So legalities perhaps not so much as that declaration inclusive of this type of conveyance, but perhaps that sense of, and this is something I touched on a little bit as well, I don't recall if it was in the last video or maybe the one before that, but an equality before the law, equality in that inner sense of standing on the same ground. We're all on equal footing. So in a sense of this generally applicable wisdom, acting as, expressing as, qualified as an internal legal code, sort of akin to that sense of integrity within oneself. And it's also interesting, I'm reminded now of when I was looking at the center embedded juxtaposed with the edge embedded, and how the edge embedded maintained that connection between the actor and the action. Excuse me. And perhaps there is some framework, or that framework can, I don't know if I'd say replace, but the focus perhaps could migrate, or there is an invitation here to shift the focus toward a framework that maybe is more edge embedded than it is center embedded. That frames not necessarily legal code in the way that we think about it with these performative utterances and perhaps modal verbiage, but more so in a framework around wisdom experienced, experiential wisdom expressed as in sort of an edge embedded framework.
One bullet goes to his femur, the horse falls on him, and 4 months ago, the horse was dead. And he was really
Can I step away and can you guys handle this?
not had his leg amputated, it took him 2 years to recover. But he became, after the was extraordinarily famous, although he still never got the recognition, music pros in general, he never got that recognition. I'm actually reading about this British character. Yeah, so that's the scoop right there. So
Was General Stark part of the Hampshire, Vermont? So I think I'd like to watch C-17.
The shot heard around the world marks the beginning of America's war for independence from Britain. At the battles of Lexington and Concord, militias made up of farmers, merchants, and other everyday citizens unite to ward off British Army troops. The fighting soon spreads to Boston, and again the fearsome army of England is turned back. Perhaps the Americans can win their fight for liberty. The Continental Congress entrusts an official army to George Washington as its commander-in-chief. But as more and more reinforcements arrive from Britain, the tide turns against the Americans. The American situation gets even more grim. In August of 1776, the British commander-in-chief, General William Howe, soundly defeats Washington's army and captures the city of New York. Thousands of American soldiers are killed, wounded, or captured. Many others lose heart and head for home, while those at home are divided amongst themselves, between rebelling patriots and those still loyal to the British crown. The United States of America had been born only a month earlier with the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Now it seems that the new nation, this self-declared democracy, may be put down while still in its infancy.
Not sure how well I show up. I'm a little bit shadowed. I hope that you can see in the background how vastly beautiful this Saratoga National Historic Park is. It's honoring what they consider to be the pivotal point during the Revolutionary War, where the American troops' success really solidified the sort of victory over Britain, grounded the Declaration of Independence even more into the hearts and minds of those who came over here to make new lives. I guess this goes with the theme of the darkness in the previous video that I had. So I came out here to do a video with the intention of starting to build a potential framework for perceiving law a bit differently through an inner landscape that perceives law more akin to intention and intentionality. And so in preparation for this video, I watched a video I did from several weeks ago called Unreasonable Matters, and in that video, I touched a little bit on criminality and punishment through reviewing certain Supreme Court cases. And in reviewing that video, for this video, there were so many points of inspiration that came through that I jotted down in my little notebook, and reviewing those notes and sort of beginning the formulation, if you will, of a building block for this different perception of law and what law could be and what law feels like within oneself. Because what law feels like within oneself, when feeling into that and when really contemplating and observing how law plays out within oneself and how law is narrated within oneself, the sort of inner legal code, how that expresses and how that is structured in the way that we communicate, the way that we communicate with ourselves and the way that we communicate in relationships with others. It's really interesting to observe and witness how that legal code, in its expression within oneself and sort of externally, how observing that can almost write can in a way almost restructure how law plays out within our social engagements and our social relationships and within the relationships we have within sort of institutions that are sort of founded on this officialization of it. And as I was sitting just now, sort of reviewing these notes and kind of leaning into where I was at when I was writing them, which was yesterday, I felt like I was hitting this blockage. Partially, I believe that to be because filming outside of my apartment is still quite awkward for me, and so processing the feelings that are going through me and sort of tapping into a feeling of peace and just peace and focusing on the current expression and focusing on presence in this expression. It takes a minute. And so as I'm getting into this flow, it is a bit more effortless. And so I suppose where I'm at right now is it's very interesting to me to really conceptualize based on what I've explored in past videos, pulling at these threads of frameworks and structures that really govern and guide the experiences that we have from inside out, and how that perception and how that experience and through that perceptual lens, how that really reshapes the landscape of how reality is perceived and experienced. And so with everything that's going on experientially in what is appearing to happen externally, it's interesting to question and inquire into what other possibilities exist. What other possibilities exist for experiencing what is perceived as law and order, and especially within social engagements that speaks from inside out, sort of merging all these different perceptions together to feel into and experience that which is greater than the sum of its parts. And I know that it sounds very abstract, and it is very abstract in the narration. It's in the experience and the focusing on particular circumstance that I think really grounds this abstract sort of theorizing. I get into the mindset of, what was I thinking? But there's definitely an invitation here to build. Really deconstructing the perception of law and perceiving those elements, if you will, those aspects, in a way that asks what feels workable now. With the cognitive understanding that there are infinite aspects, there are infinite elements, and I suppose there is a felt invitation here currently, because there is an understanding cognitively that perhaps getting too tied down to a notion of discovering perceptually, cognitively, all the elements before there can be a building, a new building, a restructuring, or even just an idea of building sort of anew, for lack of a better phrase, that perhaps it's okay to acknowledge that perceived lack of information, and knowing internally that there is enough to move forward. And so that's kind of what I feel in the moment, and that's really exciting. It's overwhelming, it feels overwhelming, but it also feels exciting. And so there is this desire within me to really go back and look over a lot of what I've explored, to pull at those threads and see what weaves together in what feels workable, in what feels aligned, if you will. What feels exciting. So I'm not exactly sure how moving forward this is going to be expressed. The tendency here is to just wing it in terms of expression and just allow whatever wants to express without any script. However, with this particular intention, it may feel more aligned to attempt a writing. I'm not going to say with 100% certainty that that is how it will unfold. I just feel inclined toward and feel this gravitation toward fitting these explorations together. In a way, they almost kind of feel like they're hanging out there, which is okay. And I acknowledge that reality of them just kind of hanging there sort of loose. It just feels like there is also a gravitation toward pulling at those expressions and kind of seeing what jives together, if anything, and what may come from that, what may come of that. There's also still a desire to move beyond just that intentionality and to continue exploring beyond just sort of the pulling at what has already been expressed, if you will. So there's sort of this backward motion and this pull forward simultaneously. And so in a way, I kind of feel like I'm juggling both aspects here, both looking back and looking forward with the intention of remaining present in and grounded in what feels centered in a sense of integrity here. Still feels awkward. But I'm glad I did this. I'm glad I did this. Perhaps a lot of the insecurity I feel in recording myself expressing like this isn't even the environment, isn't even what appears to be happening or not happening. It's interesting because it's like I almost feel this desire and this quote-unquote sort of need to do a feeling I have justice. And in a way that kind of is reminding me of the legal inner code, and I suppose I ask myself, what is being done justice? What does that even mean? What do I mean with myself when I even say that and have that thought? Do something, do a feeling, do a thought, do a vision, if you will, justice. I suppose in a way it's this idea of living up to an expectation, of realizing an expectation. But I don't necessarily want to say that an idea, a feeling, a sense, if you will, is simply an expectation. Or is it? Is it an expectation in the sense of that pull that feels like a gravitation toward what I can sense to be possible, realized, manifest, and the feeling of it is so strong and the feeling of it is so real, and yet articulating that and narrating it in that sort of formulaic structure of sentence language is an interesting attempt at containing that feeling in a grounded sense. And so doing it justice is sort of this structuring that fits. A structure that fits the sensation. And I suppose with an inner legal code, and by inner legal code I really just mean, I don't know, does it mean inner wisdom? Does it mean inner ethical sensibilities, moralistic sensibilities? Inner discernment, inner sort of discernment of what is aligned within one's sense of integrity, structuring articulation and structuring experience so that the sense is fitting, befits the experience. Is that what I said? The experience befits the sense and the sense befits the experience. And so there's that desire to sort of create order, which is often seen in court decisions and statutory codification, is this desire to sort of create order. And yet in that order, it doesn't necessarily, I don't know, does it? Does it fit? Is it doing the sense of order justice? Perhaps justice is that fit. I feel like I'm getting in a little bit of a flow here, but I guess at this point I'm not even really sure what I mean by justice. I'm not even really sure what I mean when it's said to be just, fair, balanced. Symmetrical? Okay. Which is interesting because organically in nature, is anything perfectly symmetrical? In some dimensional sense, yes. In other dimensional senses, perhaps no. Observationally, even looking at a leaf, it's not perfectly symmetrical. The face is not perfectly symmetrical. It's interesting, actually, because the manufactured order attempts to be perfectly symmetrical. Perhaps this ties back, this is reminding me of general applicability in law. There's some weird stuff going on in these lands. Oh. I suppose in a way I am simply reflecting on an invitation I have felt and a gravitation to really explore the depths of what it is to deconstruct on a theological, okay, on a theoretical, sort of metaphysical, ontological level, law and legality, and how that is reflected within oneself and the experience within oneself and the sensibilities within oneself, and how that framework, how the structuring of those sensibilities and the structuring of those expressions guide and generate and narrate the realities that we experience within ourselves and in this sort of external reality within social engagements, and how those perceptions, when looked at through this sort of deconstructed fundamental lens, foundational sort of lens, how that deconstruction not only sort of opens the landscape for reconstruction, but it scatters the materials in a way that really creates this tapestry, or illuminates this tapestry, this quilt of possibility in the potential of reshuffling those materials and re-perceiving those materials and observing those materials in a way that feels fitting within one's internal landscape, internal guidance system. On a relatively personal, but also simultaneously impersonal way. Objective as much as possible within the human experience. So these are the types of things that I really intend to focus on moving forward, in addition to continuing to explore beyond just this intentionality, but to continuing to explore a lot of other contexts that are of interest and seeing how this weaving together continues. I feel I do kind of feel like I'm speaking a bit timidly. And it's interesting because when I speak to myself, when I feel... There are times where I will speak about this to myself. I will express similarly with myself when I'm not recording in my apartment, and I notice a vast difference between the expression then in those moments and the expression currently in moments like this where I'm speaking in front of a camera, whether I'm in my apartment or not, but especially when I'm not in my apartment. It's almost as though on the confidence scale it goes, and that is also an intention of mine, is to allow myself to feel how I feel. And if I feel timid, I feel timid, and that's okay. And I want to allow myself the grace and the safety to feel timid in this experience. And yet, even as I'm saying this and becoming focused in the presence of the feeling and the presence of the expression that is coming through, it almost feels as though I transform into talking to myself from a higher perspective, talking to myself from the perspective of a confident expression that has intention and knows within itself that it... How does this want to articulate? It is moving in a direction that feels correct for it. It is moving in a direction that it feels confidently is what it wants to be moving toward, what it desires. And so there's a learning curve here, and that is perfectly okay. And I am perfectly okay to sit in the presence and the unfoldment of that learning curve. So, a bit bizarre, definitely a bit bizarre, but also exciting and very, very different for me. So pushing those boundaries a little bit at a time for this Taurus, it's graduality. So, yep, on this very, very beautiful, beautifully gorgeous day, I am now going to go back to my apartment and cook myself some lovely vegetables, inclusive of a sweet potato that I'm very excited for. So, and perhaps start editing this video. We'll see. I don't know. We'll see. But for now, signing off.